Okay, so, wow, you guys have been sending in some seriously interesting stuff this time. Articles, reports, even some, pretty heated online discussions. And it all boils down to one question. How far does China's influence really go in South Korea?
Right. It's a question a lot of people are asking.
Yeah, some of the headlines are kind of wild. CCP was behind voter fraud, secret Chinese police stations. It's giving me spy thriller vibes.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex situation.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Give us some context. What's the historical relationship been like between China and South Korea?
Well, it's always been this kind of delicate balancing act. South Korea is right there between these massive, powerful neighbors, and their history with China has been, a mix of cooperation and tension.
A classic geopolitical puzzle.
Exactly. And all this recent stuff just brings that influence into sharp focus. Everyone wants to know how deep it goes and what it really means.
Yeah, and it's not just history. The current political scene in South Korea is, it's been intense. The impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol, the standoff between investigators and security forces. What's the role of China in all this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. There's this focus on the Democratic Party of Korea, the DPK. Some sources are painting them as pro-China, potentially even trying to shift the country closer to Beijing.
Interesting. So are we talking about a full-blown political shift? Or is it more subtle than that?
It's hard to say for sure, but South Korea's own National Intelligence Service, the NIS, they've actually reported on potential attempts by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, to influence South Korean politics.
Okay, so this isn't just speculation. We've got actual intelligence reports backing this up.
Right, and some analysts believe that China might actually prefer a DPK government in Seoul.
Okay, so that raises the stakes significantly.
Yeah, and there's this quote from Evans Revere, a former U.S. diplomat. He said, all this political chaos is working toward Beijing's advantage.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it suggests that China might be benefiting from the instability in South Korea.
So if all that's true, what does that actually look like? How is this influence playing out in real-world situations?
Well, one example that keeps coming up is this proposed amendment to the Act on testimony and appraisal.
Okay, break that down for me. What's that all about?
Basically, this amendment would force South Korean companies to reveal trade secrets during investigations.
Uh-oh. That sounds like it could be a problem.
Right. Some sources are saying this could be a huge win for China, potentially giving them access to all sorts of sensitive technology and giving them an economic edge.
So it's like economic espionage through legislation.
In a way, yeah. And it's unclear how the DPK feels about this amendment.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Are they on board with this or what?
It's complicated. President Yoon and the DPK have very different views on China.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
Well, Yoon's been much more critical of China's actions, while the DPK seems to be taking a more, conciliatory approach.
Okay, so we've got these two major political figures with different stances on China, and this amendment is right in the middle of it all.
Exactly. It's become a flashpoint in this larger power struggle.
And China's just kind of lurking in the background, potentially pulling strings?
It's a possibility that we have to consider.
Okay, so we've got potential influence in policymaking. But some of these sources take it a step further. They talk about potential election interference.
Right. That's a major concern that's being raised by several experts.
Like who?
Well, there's Bruce Cleaner from the Heritage Foundation. He's arguing that China might be trying to drive a wedge between South Korea and the U.S.
Okay, so how would they do that?
Well, he suggests that China could be playing this good cop role, appearing more friendly to Seoul, while simultaneously trying to undermine the U.S.-South Korea alliance.
So basically driving a wedge between the two allies by appearing to be the more reasonable partner.
Exactly. And Klinger also points to China's United Front Work Department.
Okay, I got to stop you right there. What is the United Front Work Department? It sounds like something straight out of a spy novel.
It might sound like fiction, but it's a real department within the CCP. Basically, it's dedicated to influencing public opinion and policy abroad.
So it's like a propaganda machine.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. It's about shaping perceptions and building relationships, not just straight-up propaganda.
Okay, so this United Front Work Department, is it actively involved in South Korea?
It's hard to say for sure, but remember that NIS report you mentioned? They highlighted 38 fake Korean-language news websites spreading pro-China and anti-U.S. content.
Right, so these websites could be linked to the United Front Work Department.
We can't say for sure, but it's definitely a possibility.
Okay, so what else is on the table here in terms of potential interference?
Well, there have even been reports of Chinese agents setting up illegal police operations in other countries to monitor and potentially even intimidate Chinese citizens living abroad.
Whoa, That's a whole other level of unsettling.
Yeah, it raises questions about how far China is willing to go to exert its influence.
So are we connecting these police operations to South Korea?
There's no direct evidence yet, but some experts are concerned that similar activities could be happening there too.
Okay, so that's police operations, fake news websites.
Yeah.
What else are we looking at?
Well, there's also the potential for online manipulation. Professor Kang Junyoung from Hankook University of Foreign Studies, he suggests that China might be using internet trolls and AI-powered chatbots to manipulate public opinion in South Korea.
That's like something out of Black Mirror.
Right. It's a new frontier in information warfare, and South Korea is right on the front lines.
So it's not just about controlling what people see. It's about shaping how they think.
Exactly.
Professor Lim Jong-in from Korea University, he brings up a good point that it's not just China. We need to be aware of any actor with a vested interest in shaping South Korea's political landscape.
Right. It's like a game of chess with multiple players vying for power and influence.
So we're talking about China, North Korea, potentially even other countries.
Exactly. It's a complex web of geopolitical maneuvering, and South Korea is caught right in the middle.
Okay, so it sounds like the online world is becoming a battleground for influence in South Korea.
Absolutely. That's where a lot of the action is happening these days.
Are there specific examples of how this is playing out?
Well, there are suspicions that Chinese agents are manipulating online discussions on platforms like Naver and Daum, which are super popular in South Korea.
So they're trying to control the narrative in these online spaces.
Exactly. They want to shape public opinion and ultimately influence the decisions made by voters.
It's like a digital puppet show with China, trying to control the narrative from behind the scenes.
It's a powerful analogy. It really captures the essence of what's happening.
And some people are calling for stronger legislation to prevent this kind of foreign interference in their elections.
Right. They want to protect their democracy from outside influence.
It's a battle for the hearts and minds of voters.
Yeah.
And it's happening in the digital space.
And it's not just about winning elections. It's about shaping the future of South Korea.
So we've talked about political influence, potential election interference, but it goes beyond that, right?
Yeah.
We've also got sources talking about China trying to rewrite Korean history and claim aspects of Korean culture as their own.
Yeah, that's a whole other dimension to this. This idea that China is trying to erase or at least diminish Korean cultural identity.
And this isn't just like a fringe theory. This is something that's being actively discussed and debated.
Absolutely. It's a real concern for a lot of people in South Korea.
So what are some examples of this happening?
Well, the Northeast Project is a big one. It's a Chinese academic initiative that's been accused of trying to claim historical ownership over things like kimchi and hanbok, which are like deeply ingrained in Korean culture.
That's got to be infuriating for Koreans. It's like
Yeah.
someone trying to steal your family history.
Right. It's seen by many as a deliberate attempt to diminish South Korea's unique cultural heritage.
And assert China's dominance in the region.
Exactly. And it's not just history and food. There's also this concern that China is trying to control and manipulate the Korean wave.
Oh, right. The global phenomenon of K-pop and Korean dramas.
Exactly. The CCP sees the Korean wave as a threat to their own cultural influence.
So they're trying to control the narrative around Korean pop culture.
Right. They want to make sure that anything coming out of South Korea aligns with their own interests.
And we've even got a case study here, Shen Yun Performing Arts, a group that showcases traditional Chinese culture. They were allegedly pressured by the Chinese government to cancel their show in South Korea.
Yeah, that's pretty blatant censorship. It suggests that China is willing to go to great lengths to silence dissenting voices.
It's all about controlling the narrative and suppressing any alternative perspectives.
And it raises serious questions about freedom of expression and artistic freedom.
So we've got political influence, economic pressure, cultural appropriation, digital manipulation. It's a pretty overwhelming picture of China's reach in South Korea.
It's definitely multifaceted and far-reaching, and we're only just scratching the surface.
So where do we go from here? What's next in this deep dive?
Well, in the next part, we're going to delve even deeper into the economic aspects of this relationship and explore how South Korea's economic dependence on China might be playing a role in all of this.
That's a whole other can of worms. I can't wait to unpack it with you. Stay tuned, everybody.
So we've been talking about all this influence from China and South Korea's politics and culture, but there's this whole other layer too.
Oh, yeah. Their economies are pretty intertwined, right?
Exactly. South Korea relies heavily on China for trade, especially in key industries like semiconductors and rare earth minerals. Those are crucial.
Right. And some of what we've been reading paints that as kind of a weak point,
Mm-hmm.
like China could use it to pressure South Korea.
Definitely a concern. And there's that whole situation with the THAAD missile defense system back in 2017.
Oh, yeah. What happened there again?
Well, South Korea decided to host the U.S. LAD system, which China was really unhappy about, and they ended up retaliating economically.
Oh, wow. So they basically punished South Korea for siding with the U.S. on security.
Pretty much. It was a clear message that there would be consequences for decisions that go against China's interests.
Like a don't mess with us kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's not just about retaliation either. There's a growing worry that China's making moves to dominate those crucial industries. We talked about batteries, semiconductors.
So if they control those sectors, South Korea's kind of stuck.
Right. Yeah, their economic security would be at risk, big time. And some sources call this strategy political warfare.
Political warfare. That sounds intense.
It is. The idea is that China's using a combination of tactics, economic pressure, cultural influence, maybe even disinformation campaigns to achieve their political goals.
So it's not just about military might. It's about using all these different tools to gain power and influence.
Exactly. It's a much more subtle and complex approach.
Yeah.
But potentially very effective.
Okay. And we can't forget about Joshua Phillips from the Epoch Times. He had some pretty strong opinions about all this.
Oh, yeah. He even suggested that China might be behind those alleged voter fraud cases we discussed, not just in South Korea, but in the U.S., too.
Wait, seriously? He thinks China's trying to manipulate elections in multiple countries.
That's what he's suggesting. It's a bold claim for sure. And we always have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Of course. But it's definitely something to think about.
Right. And he also talked about China using liaison work and front organizations to infiltrate various sectors of society, which just kind of connects back to that United Front Work Department we discussed.
It's like they're trying to influence decision-making from within.
Exactly. Working behind the scenes to shape the narrative and promote their own interests.
Okay, so we've got political influence, economic pressure, cultural appropriation, potential election interference, covert manipulation. It's a pretty daunting picture of China's influence in South Korea.
It's definitely complex, and it raises some important questions about how South Korea can navigate this relationship and maintain its own autonomy.
Especially with that economic dependence looming over everything.
Exactly. But it's not like South Korea is just sitting back and accepting all this. You mentioned earlier this idea of a state of enlightenment among young Koreans.
Oh, yeah. It's like they're waking up to the reality of China's influence.
Yeah.
And they're not too happy about it.
Right. They're seeing those strings being pulled, and they want to break free.
So what's driving this enlightenment?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. Increased awareness of China's actions, growing concerns about their own economic future, and maybe even a sense of disillusionment with the status quo.
It's like they're realizing that the old ways of doing things aren't working anymore, and they need to find a new path.
Exactly. And it's happening under a state of emergency amidst all this political turmoil.
It's like a moment of clarity in the middle of a crisis.
Precisely. And this awareness isn't limited to the younger generation. You mentioned earlier how former President Moon Jae-in was seen as more accommodating to China, while current President Yoon Suk-yeol is perceived as taking a tougher stance.
Yeah, it's like two completely different approaches to dealing with China. And it reflects a deeper ideological divide within South Korea itself.
Absolutely. And it's fueled by events like those allegations surrounding the hand missile defense system. Some people believe that Moon's administration might have shared sensitive information with China.
Wow. So now it's not just about policy differences. It's about potential compromises on national security.
It's a serious accusation for sure. And it feeds into this narrative of a power struggle between those different visions for South Korea's future.
It's like South Korea is stuck in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war between China and the U.S.
Exactly. And the current constitutional debates and the impeachment saga only add to the complexity. It suggests deep divisions within South Korean society.
So we've got external pressure from China, internal divisions within South Korea, and a younger generation that's increasingly skeptical of the status quo. It's a lot to unpack.
It certainly is. But it's important to remember that South Korea is not a passive player in all of this. They have their own agency and their own interests.
Right. They're not just going to roll over and let China dictate their future.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating. How will South Korea navigate these challenges? And what does it mean for the future of the region? You know, it's funny you should mention a game because this whole situation, it really feels like watching a game of Go play out, but on a massive scale.
Right, with China making these carefully calculated moves to secure its position, and South Korea right in the middle of it all, trying to figure out its next move.
And that analogy is really fitting, too, because Go originated in China, right? And it's deeply embedded in their strategic thinking.
Yeah, it makes you think about all those sources we've been looking at. They definitely point to this trend of China being more assertive, willing to use soft power and economic leverage to get what they want.
Yeah, even if it means pushing the boundaries of what's considered acceptable internationally.
It's almost like a wake-up call, not just for South Korea, but for other democracies too, especially those who are dealing with a rising China.
Right. This isn't just about South Korea. It's a global issue with implications for the balance of power worldwide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what makes this even more complex is that it's not just about physical territory or economic influence. We're also talking about a battle for ideology, cultural dominance, even for the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah, it's a much deeper and more nuanced struggle than just traditional geopolitics.
And for everyday people in South Korea trying to just live their lives, it must feel like they're being pulled in so many different directions.
Yeah, caught between these massive forces.
Exactly. And that's why this whole state of enlightenment thing is so interesting.
Right. It shows that people, especially younger Koreans, they're becoming aware of all this. They're seeing how complex this situation really is.
And they're not just sitting back passively. They're questioning the narratives they've been given. They're demanding more transparency. And they're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're not going to be pawns in someone else's game anymore.
Exactly. They want to be active participants in shaping their own future.
And the fact that this is happening under a state of emergency, it makes it even more remarkable.
You'd think in times of crisis, people would want to cling to the familiar, to what they know.
Right. But here we see a rejection of the old ways, a desire for something different.
It's inspiring in a way. It shows the resilience of the human spirit, that desire for freedom and self-determination.
Yeah, even in the face of these enormous pressures, they're refusing to be silenced.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
Yeah.
We started with these headlines about voter fraud and secret police.
Yeah. And now we've uncovered this intricate web of influence that China has woven within South Korea.
It affects their politics, their economy, their culture, even their online spaces. It's everywhere.
And it's not always about coercion or manipulation either.
Right. China's also pretty good at leveraging those shared cultural values, historical connections, and economic partnerships.
To build those relationships and exert soft power.
It's a long game they're playing.
Exactly. And it highlights the challenges that democracies are facing as the world changes and those traditional ideas of sovereignty are being tested.
So we've learned a lot, haven't we? Like, what started as a question about China's influence in South Korea has turned into this bigger reflection on the forces shaping our world.
And the choices we have to make as individuals and as nations.
It's a reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted. We have to be vigilant, critically evaluate the information we're getting, engage in thoughtful discussions, and most importantly, actively participate in shaping the future we want.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to everyone listening out there, keep asking those critical questions, stay informed, and stay engaged.
This has been an incredible deep dive, and we want to thank all of you for joining us. We hope this has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to keep exploring these complex issues.
And remember, the world's constantly changing. It's up to all of us to stay informed, ask those tough questions, and make our voices heard.
Thanks for listening, everyone.